Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. In the previous exercise, we practiced animating a ball rolling along the ground. And now for this exercise, we are going to animate a bouncing ball so that we can begin to explore the principle of squash and stretch. So the first thing I need to do is I need to set up my scene. I'm using the same project folder from the last animation, so I already have my ball rig in my folders. So all I need to do is go to Create Reference and open up the ball rig again. Once again, this rig was created by Carlos Contreras, and the link to it will be in the description. Then with my ball rig in the scene, I'm going to go to the polymetric shelf and just add in a plane. I'm going to make that bigger, and I'm going to add that plane to a layer. I'll call this layer ground. Hit save, and I'm going to set it to reference. So now I can't accidentally select it. Then I'm going to turn off my grid. I'm going to turn on multi-sample anti-aliasing so I can see my curves better. Then I'm going to turn on my resolution gate and just find a nice spot for my camera. Right here looks good, so I'm going to go to View, Create Camera from View. So now I've got my camera here. It's called Perspective 1. I'm going to rename it to Render Cam. And then I'm going to switch to a dual panel layout and just switch the left panel to Render Cam. And then I'll lock that camera. And I'll turn off the resolution gate on my perspective camera. And I'm going to press this button to turn on ambient occlusion, just so we can see a little bit of that shadow on the ground plane. Now, if I look at the base controller of my ball rig, I'll see this channel here called Type Ball. And when I open this up, it brings up a bunch of different types of balls that this ball can look like. So it could look like a basketball, or a baseball, or a beach ball, or a golf ball. So before you get started, you should decide on which kind of ball you're going to be using, because every ball is going to bounce a little bit differently. And this depends on things like the weight, its mass, and its elasticity. If you've ever seen a ping pong bounce off the ground, it's a lot different from, say, a bowling ball dropping on the ground. The ping pong, because it's lighter, will bounce into the air a lot more times, whereas a bowling ball is very heavy and it's not very elastic, so it just sort of hits the ground, bounces a couple times, very small bounces, and then comes to a stop. But for this one, I'm just going to stick with the plain line ball. So now I'm going to grab my base controller and I'm just going to move it back into the left side of my frame here. And I think my camera might be pointed a little bit low, so just gonna change the angle a little bit. Turn off the grid there as well. I forgot to turn it off on this panel. And okay, once my base controller is in position, I don't want to be animating it anymore or moving it at all, because I want everything else in the rig to be moving in relation to the base controller. So to animate, I'm actually going to select the next controller in the order. And I'm just going to find a nice starting position for that, all the way up here. And I think the ball is going to be moving a little bit more towards the camera than I want it to. So again, I'm going to adjust my camera. Here we go. This view is pretty flat, but it should allow me to view each bounce very clearly. Great. And then once I have my starting position, I'm going to set a keyframe. And for this, I'm going to be animating on the y-axis as well as the z-axis. So I want to make sure I keep both of these on frame 1. And now let's say the animation ends on, I'll make this 120 frames. But we'll say the movement ends on frame 90. So I'm going to go to frame 90, and I'm just going to move the ball to the ending position. So I'm going to set the translate Y to 0, so that it rests on the ground. And then on the Z-axis, I'm just going to slide it over here. So it's at around the right side of my frame. And because I had auto keyframes on, it already made the keyframe there. So now with that, we can see the ball moving from point A to point B. And with that as a starting point, then we can start adding in our bounces as it moves along the frame. So to see those keyframes in my graph editor, I'm going to have that controller selected, and then I'm going to select it here on the left-hand panel of the graph editor, and we can see my keyframes have appeared here. Now, this isn't looking quite like I want it to yet. The blue curve here is the horizontal movement, and I don't really want this to be an ease in. I want this to be a quick start to the animation. So I'm just going to press linear tangents here, and then I'm going to press this button here to break tangents so that the tangents can move independently of each other. And I'm just going to make sure this is curved up enough so that it starts at a nice speed before slowing down. So most likely I'm not going to be changing this curve anymore. If I really wanted to, I could add keyframes on each bounce to adjust the speed that it's moving horizontally to account for things like ground friction. But those forces are so minute that I'm not going to really bother with them with this example. So now we can start putting in bounces. So I'm going to go to here, and I'm going to say maybe in 10 frames, the ball is going to hit the floor. So I'm just going to set that to 0. Of course, we don't want it to ease into that, because watch what happens when you press play. It kind of just swoops down, whereas we want it to actually come down and impact. So I'm going to make this a linear tangent. I'm going to break the tangent so that these can move independently. And then I want to do one more thing. I want to right click and set this to weighted tangents. And what that means is I can adjust the weight of influence that this tangent has on the curve. So I can make it longer or shorter to have a greater influence on this animation curve. So now that comes down really suddenly, and that's good. We want it to feel like it's coming down with a lot of force, so it could rebound off the ground really well. Great, so now we have the first impact. I'm going to go and keep going and add another bounce. Let's say in 8 frames it will reach the max height again. So I can actually navigate the timeline by pressing the comma and period keys to jump between keyframes. Or if I hold Alt and then press period or comma, I can navigate frame by frame. So I'm going to press this 8 times. And I'm just going to raise up ball again. I'm going to press it 8 more times. And I'll go ahead and just copy his keyframe and paste it there. Great. So we got 2 bounces. Now with every bounce, it's going to lose power. Every time it impacts the ground, some of that power is going to be lost. And it won't be able to reach the same height as the first bounce. And each subsequent bounce is going to lose more and more power. If it's a particularly bouncy, elastic ball, this will happen slower. But again, if this is like a bowling ball, when the ball is really hard and rigid, it's going to bounce just a couple times. So, but I am interpreting this to be a pretty bouncy ball, very rubbery. So I'm probably going to get a lot of bounces out of this. Great. So now I'm going to just adjust those tangents. And I want to make sure I'm getting a nice arch going. All right. And that's pretty good for now. So for the next bounce, I'm going to go down 7 frames. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Each bounce is also going to be shorter in time because it's going to spend less time in the air. And it'll hit the ground again sooner. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Paste that key again. And then for the next one, I'm going to go for 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Paste it up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Paste the key. I'm not going to worry too much about the tangents just yet until I have all the bounces. This one I'm moving forward 5. 3, 4, 5. Paste. Now, as I start reaching this point, there's not a lot of distance from here to here, visually speaking, so it's hard to tell what this arch looks like. And the key to getting a good bounce is really clean looking arches. So to get a better view of these curves, I'm going to hold Shift and Alt, and then right click. I'm going to move my mouse up and down to adjust the scale of the graph editor. Now, this isn't actually changing anything about the curves, but it's changing the way that we see them. So now I can get a much better view of these smaller arches. And just make sure that those curves look okay. All right, move forward. 1, 2, 3, 4. And at this point, I just have to move the handle just a little bit to get it to add another keyframe. Copy that frame. 1, 2, 3, 4. We always want the number of frames on each side of this peak to be the same because we want it to spend equal time in the air going up and down. 1, 2, 3. See this side, now I'm just needing to make little tiny movements to get it up in the air. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. 2. Here's the frame. Now it's really small. I'm going to hold Shift and Alt again to expand the graph editor. And the last bounce, 1 up. I'll just key that one. Then next frame, just paste this key right here. It's really small. Just these like that. And then I'm going to select this tangent, and I'm just going to make it linear. So it just slides. Now let's see what that looks like in action. There we go. It's not perfect yet, but it's a start. So I'm going to just spend a little more time adjusting these tangents so that the arcs feel good. We want to make sure that it is spending enough time in the air, but we don't want it to feel too floaty either. So it'll take a little bit of time to get this arc to feel right. Now I'm looking over the progression of my bounces as they get smaller. And I think that the rate at which this loses power with each bounce is a little bit inconsistent. So I'm going to go back and adjust some of these so that it feels like a little bit more of a linear progression from the highest bounce to the lowest. Maybe make these initial bounces a little bit higher. Check the progression down here. There we go. That feels pretty good. So I think it would be moving horizontally for longer. So I'm going to go to my translate Y. Let's just say this goes to 110. Or even 120. I'll expand the animation to 135 frames. Yeah. I'll adjust this because it feels a little fast in the beginning. There we go. I think it might be spending a little bit too much time in the air and then coming down a little too fast. So I'm going to try to reduce the weights of some of these tangents and make them a little less extreme so that I can make the drop down to the ground a little bit less harsh and sudden. There, that's feeling pretty good for now. I could keep adjusting this later, but I want to move on to the rotation. So first I'm going to figure out which way it's going to rotate. It's going to be the x-axis. So I'll just put it somewhere natural like there, and then I will keyframe it on the first frame. And then I'm going to go to the last frame that it moves, which is 120. Select that controller again. And then I'm just going to key that again and raise the keyframe by a lot. So this ball is going to make multiple full rotations. So yeah, a number like 1,000 sounds appropriate for me. And then just like with the horizontal movement, I also want it to be rotating at the full speed from the start. I'm just going to point this curve up like this. Can make it weighted as well. And let's see how that looks. Okay. We can tell mostly once it's on the ground that it's not quite right. It's sliding right here. So I'm going to select this key, just raise it up so it rotates more. That's too much. So I'm just going to play this game of push and pull until it feels somewhat right. It's a little bit slidey, but it's better. Okay. There we go. That feels pretty good. I'm going to turn off the visibility of my curves. Going to show, viewport, NURBS curves. And watch one more time. There, that feels pretty good. If you wanted to get really nitpicky about this, we could add another keyframe on each of these bounces to alter the rotational speed just a little bit to tweak it as it goes through each bounce, but I don't feel the need to do that right now. Now that I'm happy with my bouncing and rotating thus far, I can begin to add squash and stretch to this animation. Now, squash and stretch is the principle of animation that objects in motion tend to change shape while maintaining the same volume. So the quintessential example of this is, of course, a bouncing ball. So when the ball is falling, it will stretch out a little bit in the direction that it's falling. And then when it makes impact with the ground, it'll squash against that surface. And then as it lifts off the ground again, it will stretch once more into that next bounce. The stretching we see is often in part a trick of perception, as fast-moving objects tend to appear distorted, but there usually is a very real stretching happening as well. Now, if we were doing this squashing and stretching entirely by hand, we'd have to be really conscious of the volume. But thankfully, this rig has a controller to handle the squash and stretch for us. And it's this one right here at the top. So if I press it down, the ball squashes. And if I lift it up, the ball stretches. And it always maintains the same volume. Even if I squish it out to a really flat shape like this, it should still be about the same volume. So to make use of this, I'm going to go to the first frame, and I'm going to select that squash and stretch bone, and I'm going to put a key on the translate Y and the translate Z. And then I'm going to select the control I used for movement so that I can find the frame that it first collides with the ground and go to that frame. I'm going to select that top controller again. And I'm just going to move that down to about -0.6 Y. Doesn't need to be exactly there. And how far your ball will squash will depend on the properties of the ball. I'm assuming that this ball is pretty rubbery and elastic, so it should get a lot of squashing and stretching. And for this particular example, I'm going to be exaggerating my squash and stretch a lot more than you might typically see in real life. If I just leave it at that, the ball begins to squash before it hits the ground, and that's not what we want. Instead, I want to go to the frame just before it makes impact. Instead, I want to stretch it out. And I'm going to make it stretch to about the same distance that it squashes. So about 0.6. And then I want to move this controller back just a little bit so that it's stretching into the curve of this motion. So if I quickly tap the space bar with my mouse in this panel, I can isolate it. And now we can see that it stretches and squashes when it hits the ground. However, there's one little thing I need to fix right here. And I'm just going to tap the spacebar again to bring back to panel mode, and then tap it again to go into perspective view. So now on the impact frame, I want the controller to go back to 0 on the Z-axis so that it's not slanted in any direction. And it's just squashing straight down. So I'm going to make a keyframe for 0 there. And then on 11, I'm just going to move this way. I'm going to stretch it out to about 0.5-ish. I don't want it to stretch out as much as this frame, because on this frame, the ball has lost some power, and it's not going to rise as much, so it shouldn't stretch as much either. And then I'm going to select my movement controller again. I'm going to go to the peak of the next bounce. And I'm just going to set the squash and stretch keys to 0. So by the time it reaches the peak, it should no longer be stretching. It should just maintain its neutral form. And then the whole process starts over again. It'll stretch out, squash on impact, stretch, and so on and so forth. Now what's nice is I don't have to do this manually. Now that I've done it once, I can use the keyframes I set on the previous bounce for the next bounce. So I'm going to go to this frame just before it impacts. I'm going to select my squash and stretch controller. And I'm going to select these 3 frames. I'm going to copy them. And I'm going to paste them. So now I have the squash and stretch on that second bounce. However, again, I don't want it to be as extreme as the first bounce because the ball has lost some power. So I need to rein these keys in a little bit. And what I can do to do that is I'm going to select all of these. I'm going to press R to switch to my scale mode. And with my mouse held right here in the middle of the graph, so right at the 0 position, I'm going to hold Shift, middle mouse button, and I'm going to drag my mouse down to scale those frames down just a little bit. I'm going to watch this number. So before it was squashing to about 0.6. So I'm actually going to undo that. And I just want to bring it down to about 0.5. So it's not a drastic difference, but it's just a little bit less squashing and stretching. And so now by being smart, I am able to take a little bit of work and spread it out through the whole animation. From there, it's just a matter of repeating the process. So going to the next peak, selecting the bounce controller. I can even copy this frame that's just 0 and 0. Going to the key before the next bounce. Copying these keys, pasting them. Pressing R, Shift, middle mouse button, just scale them in again. I want to be on this middle frame here so I can see exactly what the squash will be. So I want to be negative 0.4 now, approximately. Bounce. So with that, I'm able to take just a couple more minutes to fill out the rest of these bounces with progressively smaller and smaller squashing and stretching. And I think from here, I'll make that my last squash and stretch, because at a certain point, the squashing and stretching would be so small, we would not perceive it. All right, and I'm just going to tap spacebar in my render cam panel to expand it. Go to the start of the animation, I'm going to press play. There we go. Great. I'm feeling pretty happy with that thus far. Now, there's one thing I want to adjust right off the top of my head, and it's this first bounce. You can see that the ball is pretty far from the surface before it immediately jumps into this squash. then pops up again. And this feels like a pretty sudden transition to go from here to here. And I feel like the ball should be a lot closer to the ground before it just immediately hits this frame. So I'm going to go to this frame. I'm going to select this controller. And I'm going to copy the frame where it hits the ground and paste it here as well. And I'm going to paste it on the frame afterwards. And I don't want it to actually be touching the ground just yet. So I'm going to select both these frames, press W and hold Shift and middle mouse button to just slide them both up a little bit. And these tangents are going in weird directions. So I'm going to select the ones I want to change and just press the linear tangents button to make them point at the middle keyframe. And then for the middle one, I'm just going to select the keyframe itself and press linear tangents. So now what that's done is it's giving me more control over the frame just before it makes impact with the ground and the frame where it's leaving the ground. So that it feels a little more connected to this pose. Then if I hit play, you can feel that bounce a lot more. You can really feel the impact because it feels like it's transitioning into it a lot better. And if I wanted to, I could do the same thing here as well. In fact, I'll even copy these frames, just paste them here. And then it's just a matter of following the same steps as before. So now those bounces really have an impact to them and a weight to them that feels pretty good. I could refine and polish this just a little bit more, but I think I'm happy with where it's at for this video. So the last thing to do is to just make sure that my render settings are okay. Set it to HD 1080. I turn off the resolution gate in my render cam and make sure it's the active camera. I'm gonna go to playback, play blast options, making sure it's saving to file. I'll just call this bouncing ball underscore rubber. So for other balls, I would name it like tennis ball, basketball, etc. And then I'll play blast this. And so that's the basics on how to animate a bouncing ball. Of course, when it comes to your animations, you want to be really conscious of the different variables, like what are the properties of your particular ball, how is it being dropped or thrown, and how much squash and stretch exaggeration is appropriate for what you're doing. So with that, I wish you luck, and I hope you have a good day.